So within this tutorial, we're going to look at the concepts of planes and axes, and I think we're going to find them really facilitating or helpful when we think about how we describe motion. Now with planes, the thing I want to sort of address with you about the concept of planes, let me just sort of draw a daft little arrow down here. We're saying with planes that they do this job for us. They help us to be able to separate the body into segments, okay? Into segments. So when we look in a moment at, for example, the sagittal plane, when we have a look in a moment at the frontal plane, it's going to help us to describe the human body in terms of different segments. You'll see the intuition of that in a few moments' time. But they also, the planes, help us to describe movement. I'm going to touch on that as well. So we've got two objectives of working with that particular content. Notice the skill of describing movement there. We may even illustrate with our descriptions sometimes. Now, with axes, we have a different objective with axes. So axes, they allow us to describe, and it's movement again they allow us to describe, but we're specifically talking about rotational movement, more of which in a second. So when we get to talk about axes, which for a large part of my life I didn't realise had the E there, I thought it was just an I, and that axis is the axis, of course, is the singular of axes, just so you are aware, because I didn't know that for a long time when I was younger. So anyway, axes allow us to describe rotational movement. So you'll hear me talking about spinning, turning a lot when we look at this stuff. All right, that's the kind of the fundamentals. Let's get on with this. Now, I'm going to introduce an image to you. Boom, there we go. Let me just drop this down a little bit down here. Look, here we have what are going to be the three primary planes of the body. Now, I'm going to take the middle one first. So my number one is going to be Sagittal. That was meant to be blue. My number one is going to be the sagittal plane here. Again, notice spelling, single G, double T. Again, I've got some problem spellings in my life. I need to be sure the sagittal plane. So what does it do? We see it actually separates, let me put sagittal up here. It actually separates the body into left and right. So we've got the sagittal plane. So it separates, we know from our first comments, that's what we want to talk about. It separates into left and right. Now, when you get further into your studies, you're also going to develop the concepts of the medial and the lateral side of the body. And I'm not going to get into it here, but just so you know, it's not just left and rightness, but it's also medial and lateral sides of different things, like different limbs, for example. So it separates into that side. And the other point we'd make about the sagittal plane is it allows us to describe the movements of flexion and extension through that plane or along that plane. So for example, if we imagine this shoulder joint here going into position of flexion, which would be in front of the body here, the arm would go in front of the body, we can see, let me just sort of change colour so that's a little bit clearer, we can see that that is along the sagittal plane. So if the arm goes into a flex position, what have I drawn? This position here, okay, the arm out in front at the shoulder, we can see that's along the sagittal plane. So we want to understand that. Secondly, I want to talk to you about the first one on here, which we're going to refer to as number 2. And number 2, let me just change colour slightly. Number 2 is what we refer to as the frontal plane. The frontal plane. You'll notice on the image here, it can also be referred to as the coronal, but I'm going to encourage you to talk about the frontal plane. So again, you can see here, it separates into front and back. And I encourage all of you to realise that if we talk about the front of something, we call it the anterior side. And if we're talking about the back of the body, it's the posterior. Posterior like your posterior bum. So posterior and anterior. So we're going to call it front and back for simplicity's sake now. But please, 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 please realise that you really should be referring, in the future at least, to anterior and the posterior side of the body. So when you hear a muscle name like Tibialis Anterior, which is, by the way, a muscle which kind of runs along the shin here, okay, you would know tibialis, it's on the tibia, anterior, the front of the tibia, and of course that describes where it is. But anyway, the frontal plane separates front and back. But the other point I want to make about the frontal plane, now I've changed my colour slightly, is it helps us to describe movements of abduction, and adduction. abduction, and adduction. So if you imagine, for example, that this performer's shoulder abducts into this position, look, you can see it's moving through the frontal plane, or it starts to adduct, for example, to here or to here. You can see that it's moving along the frontal plane. So it helps us to describe those movements. And finally, on planes and axis, we have what we call the transverse plane. So I'm going to put it in here, transverse. Now, the transverse plane is very useful because it allows us to separate the body into top and bottom. Okay, so top and bottom half of the body. But please consider using the terms superior for anything above the plane and inferior for anything below the plane. Superior and inferior, they're great terms to learn, and you may well use them in the future on your studies. Now, in terms of movement, they help us to describe internal and external rotation. Okay, so let me give you an example of that. Internal and external rotation. So let me just change colour so something a little more clear. Let's go for a dark green. So for example, if I take this hand, imagine this hand rotated at the wrist in this way. We might do that, for example, because, I don't know, we're spin bowling a cricket ball, for example, or something like that. The hand moves from a position of, as it is now, supination into a position of pronation. Okay, so if we twist limbs, such as the arm, or indeed, let's say that this person turns their hip out this way so that their foot is kind of pointing in this direction, that is moving along this plane. Okay, so internal and external rotation, and good examples of that are what we call pronation and supination. These are the movements of turning our wrist at the radial-ulnar joint, so our palm is up and our palm is down. Pronation and supination happens along this axis. Okay, so this plane, I apologize. So there are planes. Let's now have a look at axes of rotation. And you always need the help of a skimpily dressed, almost naked person to help you with axes. And in fact, I'm also going to put my toolbar on at this point because I'm going to draw some straight lines in a second. So what have we got here? We've got a performer, and they have axes of the body, which means that with these axes, axes equal rotation. So this performer is capable of rotating in different ways through different axes of the body. So the first one I'm going to show you, and let me make a straight line here. The first one I'm going to show you is this axis here. Okay, so imagine that what I've just drawn there is a solid iron bar that's going straight through the hips. Okay, not a very pleasant thought, but it basically makes this person like a table football player, doesn't it, right? So Conor McGregor here almost becomes like a table footballer, the Blues versus the Reds. So imagine that if this bar, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Imagine that if this bar was twisted in this way, of course, what would happen here is his upper body would start to rotate downwards and forwards, a bit like something like a frontal somersault. Okay, now we refer to this as the sagittal, seen that word before, the sagittal axis. Now, just be aware it's also in other studies called the transverse axis, but the sagittal axis, and it allows performers to do motions such as a somersault. Okay, but also, for example, if you imagine that the legs come upwards, this would also be something like a seat drop in trampolining, for example, or if Conor McGregor just raises his right leg to do, a knee to the chest, that is also rotation around that sagittal axis. So any rotation in any direction around this bar is going to be rotation around the sagittal axis, but the classic example is a somersault. The only point I would make is that later on in your studies we also have sagittal axes of all joints. The knees, the ankles, the shoulders, the elbows, these are also all sagittal axes. Just be aware of it. I'm actually going to get rid of those for now, but it's just, you might want to develop an intuition for that in case you study this in a bit of detail later on. Now, the second axis I want you to have an awareness of, let me choose a different color. Let's go for a little orange. The second axis I want you to have an awareness of is what we call the frontal axis. Okay, so this frontal axis, I'm going to do it on a slight angle, but it's operating here through the navel of the body. Okay, so through through the navel of the body here. Okay, let me just choose my pen color. So we've still got my thing there, apologies. So here the bar operates through this navel. So if you imagine that that this bar was rotated, okay, it would involve this performer. I mean, not that they're going to do it too often, but they do things like heel kicks, for example. This frontal axis, it allows people to do things such as cartwheels, okay, which, funny enough, in MMA do get used sometimes. So things like cartwheels. So imagine if this bar was rotated, it would twist this entire performer to kind of go in that direction, right? They would rotate in that direction. That's what we call the frontal axis. And the final one I'd like you to have an awareness of, let's go for a nice kind of sea blue. The final one I'd like you to have an awareness of is what we call the vertical axis. Or I'm going to restate that, what your exam board call the vertical axis. And in my opinion, they're deeply responsible for doing so. I'll explain why in a second. But what this allows us to do, and let me put it in for you, what this allows us to do is any rotation around this blue bar. So if you can imagine that this blue bar was to rotate in this direction, or indeed in this direction here, clockwise or anti-clockwise, it's effectively going to cause this performer to do some kind of twist. So in this case, you know, this person might do, I don't know, a spinning elbow, for example, or kind of like a various different kicking actions, roundhouse kick, for example. They would be rotating around this vertical axis, okay? Things like half twist, full twist in trampolining and gymnastics, things such as turning around a slalom pole in skiing, these are all around the vertical axis. But here's my problem, exam board. What if this person is not standing up? What if this person, let's say that this person in a gymnastics move is actually at this angle, okay? What that would suggest is that your vertical axis isn't vertical at all, okay? Because they're actually at this angle. Vertical, of course, is up there. So in other studies and later on, you'll actually learn this correctly as the longitudinal axis. But for now, refer to it as the vertical axis. But for now, this is kind of what you need to know. In my opinion, this is what you should know. But anyway, these are potentially different things. But the point I would make about is that that vertical axis causes rotation from a solid bar through from the top to the bottom of the body. And if it's twisted, if that bar is turned, then of course a twist is produced. And we call that twist rotation around the vertical axis. If it's the sagittal axis, it's producing things like somersaults. If it's the frontal axis, producing things like cartwheels. And the vertical axis we've just seen produces things such as twists. Thanks.